Do you remember the musical Grease? The movie that was made from it in like the late 70s, early 80s. Some of you who are of the younger generations maybe have caught it on Netflix. If not, it's a bit of Americana that you'll enjoy. The premise, of course, of Grease is that Sandy, the good girl, meets Danny, the bad boy, over the summer, but she doesn't know that's who he is until she transfers to his school, and there's this culture clash. And the movie is an ongoing process of him and the other bad boys trying to defile her, basically, until the movie has this emotional, dramatic culmination where she gives up her morals and virtue and sweet Marsha Brady-looking hairstyle to go all perm and tight leather and presumably everything else that goes with it, and then joins the bad crowd. And then that's the end. It's really a sad portrait of Americana, if you think about it. But we loved it, right, as kids. And I think there's a little like Danny in most of us guys, or maybe a little Sandy. And I realized that art imitated life for me in my childhood, where I had a little bit of a Sandy experience. And it kind of makes me sad, to be honest with you, looking back. So I grew up in a military family, which means that we lived where the Army sent us. And for the formative years of my elementary school, that was outside of Washington, D.C., because my dad was at the Pentagon. And so I went to school there, and there's a sort of parity socially in the D.C. suburbs, if you've ever lived there, because there's a degree of socioeconomic equity, because most people's families are in government service, and they move in and out of town, and so everybody's sort of transient, and while we're there we sort of band together and make friends, and it works. Well, I had a high time in early elementary school. I was kind of Mr. Class Spirit, and the guy that was in the middle of everything and liked everybody and was well liked. And then my father retired from the service, took a job with a defense contractor outside of Boston, and we moved to Massachusetts, where nobody moves new. Everybody's lived there for 3 and 4 generations, since their great-great-grandparents came over from Ireland or Italy or something, right? And people who are Southern Baptist aren't. There really aren't any. That was all like my folks and us. They were all kind of Irish Catholic or Roman Catholic, and then some Jewish folks, and that was sort of it. And there I plopped in the middle of 4th grade at the age of 10 into this community. Just think Matt Damon and Ben Affleck and Good Will Hunting. It's that. It's all that. It's all that harshness and all that jabbing each other and all that foul language and all that in 4th grade. It was that life. I mean, that was very accurate, not exaggerating it. And so I plop into that. And I had to say a rude awakening is an understatement. For the first time in my life, I was not accepted. I mean, I was completely rejected. I came in and I think I was totally naive that things like cold, hard New England edge existed. And so I walked in, I'm like, hi, I'm Rob, want to be my friend? It was kind of like Buddy the Elf. Buddy the Elf, what's your favorite color? And everybody, I got the collective middle finger. And it was so, I know, right? It was sad. I went home and I was like, and I didn't come from the most emotionally communicative home, so I didn't talk about this with my parents. I just they're like, how was school today? Good? And, I mean, it was a hard time in my life. I was used to kids liking me and doing and saying things that people laughed at and organizing parties and everyone wanting to come and being the life of the classroom. And I was just on the outside. And so the truth is I kind of sandied myself. Do you know what I mean? Over the course of that year, I let them change me because I wanted to be liked and accepted. Rejection, for the first time in my life, was so hurtful. And I had so little context for how it worked and what I was supposed to do. But the truth of the matter is my heart knew what I was supposed to do. And what I stood for, how my parents raised me, and the kind of person I was, kind of over the course of a year went out the window. And it took me a lot of life to unlearn that. And I'm ashamed of it. Like, my parents raised me to be the guy who doesn't make fun of the fat kid, who doesn't tease girls. And I turned into sort of a jerk because I wanted to be liked and accepted. And I'm ashamed to say that to you, even though I was 10. But I think there's a little Sandy in all of us. A little voice that when we get rejected, when we are disliked, when we don't fit in, wants to do whatever it takes to make that feel better. Jesus can relate. Did you know? Where we are in our study through Jesus last week is John 15. He says famously to start that chapter, I am the true grapevine and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch of mine that doesn't produce fruit. And he prunes the branches that do bear fruit so they will produce even more. You have already been pruned and purified by the message I have given you. So remain in me and I will remain in you. One of the towering skyscrapers of Jesus' teaching moments on the skyline of this, his most significant week of life. Abide in me, some of the more traditional translations render it. Abide in me, and I will abide in you. Well, as we've discovered 4 weeks into this series called Crashing, where we look at the last week of Jesus' life, but not through the traditional lens of these 6 chapters of John, where we snap to the great significance theologically that they bring, which is undeniable and primary. What it means to be saved and to walk with Jesus and Holy Week and all of its layers. But rather, we're starting from the point of view of Jesus' granular experience of humanity in his own darkest hour. So we're doing a zoom in and work our way out study where typically in passages like this, we start with the macro lens and maybe get a little bit into how Jesus walked through it. So we're starting with Jesus the man, which is consistent with our understanding of the Gospel of John, which unlike the 3 so-called synoptic Gospels, which provide an orderly synopsis of Jesus' life as their primary aim, John's Gospel is more like a tapestry, like a mosaic picture, weaving together stories and impressions and feelings and interactions from Jesus' own closest friend to give us a portrait of the man and help us to understand the gospel, I believe, from the inside out. So that's what we're doing in this series. And what we find is that in this week, to be sure, Jesus as a man is crashing. He is entering his darkest time and he's feeling it. And he's sharing it with his disciples. And here in a moment, we'll find that this toweringly significant teaching in John 15 is given in the context of Jesus moving to Boston and being rejected, coming with the best of intentions and being hated and disliked and having to cope with that. Our title this morning is On Being Disliked. In verse 18, if you'll fast forward there with me, he says to his disciples, if the world hates you, remember that it hated me first. The world would love you as one of its own if you belonged to it, if you played its game, if you said what it said and did what it wanted you to do. But you're no longer part of the world. I chose you to come out of the world, so it hates you. Do you remember what I told you? A slave is not greater than the master. Well, since they persecuted me, naturally, they will persecute you. And if they'd listened to me, they would listen to you. They will do all this to you, and it's not because of you. It's because of me. For they've rejected me and the one who sent me. There is a cold reality in this bit of context that Jesus provides. You know, his context in these 6 chapters describing his last week works kind of like a second line of music. Like you have a melody line and a harmony line maybe up here. Well, Jesus' melody line, so to speak, is his teaching, what's happening at face value, what he's telling his disciples to prepare them to build the church. But the harmony line is what's going on in his life and what he's feeling, what he's experiencing, and how that's informing what he's teaching. And so you see chapter after chapter, the melody line of what he's saying and the harmony line of what he's experiencing. And I believe this portion 18 to 21 here is kind of like the harmony line, and it gives us what Jesus is feeling, how it's going down as a backdrop and a context, and really an illumination of a cold, hard reality for him and his disciples and for you and me 20 centuries later. And that is that, listen, it is impossible to stand for anything and be liked by everyone. Did you know that? It is impossible to stand for Jesus, a political platform, decency and order, to stand for anything and be liked by absolutely everyone. This came into focus for me a month ago or so when one of my son's friends was staying over at our house. This is a friend who doesn't come from a Christian family, but he has a sense of God and has from a young age. And Caden's been reaching out to him, and they've been connecting, and he's come to church with us a few times, and it's really neat what's happening in his life. Well, he's a vegetarian at the age of 12. And I don't know if you've known any 12-year-old vegetarians, but I haven't, and so I kind of wanted to figure out how that works. So I was making conversation with him, and we had asked him as a family, why? Where did that come from? Are your parents vegetarians? This is kind of the family ideology that you were born into and sort of had foisted on you? No, my parents love meat. Is it an allergy, a dietary intolerance? No, I do fine with it. But he said that he sensed as a younger boy, and I don't know how this works, and it's kind of aside from the point, that God, and maybe it was a dream or something like that God had told him that to eat meat would be killing animals and that that's not good. Now, he didn't say it with any judgment. He was young and innocent enough not to know that that made all of us meat-eating people feel like, oh, well, thanks. And I didn't really feel any guilt because I think the two can coexist. I'm a both and, sort of an Eastern philosopher when it comes to animals and eating. I love animals and I love the way they taste. And I think those things work together. Like, I don't like the way they all taste. I love my dog. I have no desire to eat him. I don't love any cows personally, but I have tremendous desire to eat them. It just works for me, and so I didn't feel any guilt or shame in talking with him about this. But I was asking him, I'm like, really? So how does that play out in your life? He's in middle school. What's it like being a middle schooler and a vegetarian? And he says, oh yeah, kids pick on me. Because he's a vegetarian. They try to sneak meat into his school lunch so he eats it. And they make fun of him and they're like, oh, you're not gonna eat that. And you want a chicken nugget and stuff like that. And you can, as an adult, remember what it's like to be an adolescent when you're in that stage of life, particularly in middle school where you're figuring out security and insecurity. And largely your security comes from making others feel insecure to make yourself feel better. That's sort of the junior high version of that, which a lot of us do as adults too. And so the kids would put him down, and he kind of came to a point where he's like, I didn't like it at first, and it hurt me, and then I just decided I'm not going to let it hurt me. And I was like, Carson, I've got some advice for you. Haters are going to hate. 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 And so just shake, 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 shake. Shake it off. Shake it off. And he's like, my kids are like, Dad. This is what happens when you've got middle schoolers at home. You spontaneously quote Taylor Swift, and it's a condition, I think. Isn't it true of all of us? When you stand for anything, gosh, what is it hurting you middle schoolers that I think it's bad to eat meat? It's not like he's standing up and preaching to them. You can't be liked by everyone. As soon as you let any words come out of your mouth that have substance or go in a direction or believe a thing, people are going to reject you for it. We see it every campaign season when a politician announces that he or she is running for office and then puts out a statement of positions on a few hot button issues. Roughly 50% of the populace in the United States of America at that moment hates that person. And they might be a great guy. She might have a winning personality. Maybe. Who are you thinking of? So politically incorrect of you. Or something, but we hate them as a populace, and we'd like to say we just hate their ideology, but those things bleed, don't they? Because they believe something different than us on guns or abortion or creation or the environment. It's the way it works. It's a cold reality of human existence. Impossible to stand for anything and be liked by everyone. Jesus says it in verse 24. Look here, he says, they've seen everything I did, yet they still hate me. Why would they hate me? For healing a blind man? For restoring a widow's dead son to her? This fulfills what is written in their scriptures. They hated me without cause. You can do everything right, and at some point, it doesn't depend on you. Anyone have workplace authority? Any supervisors? Maybe you run a company and you hired employees. Maybe you manage a shift at Starbucks. But anyone supervise people? Okay, the minute you have to, if you're in retail, staff Christmas Day, someone's going to dislike you. Maybe you did it the first 2 years yourself to avoid the conflict and to be the servant leader. But this year, you got family coming in from town and you're going to let the others rotate through. But that person wasn't there when you did it the first 2 years. And they're on Christmas Day. As soon as you make a decision, you wake up in the morning and make the first decision of your work, somebody doesn't like it. Right? It's a cold, hard reality. And it's one of the human dynamics that makes living really hard. Dislike, rejection, hatred even, they're ultimately inevitable unless we stand for absolutely nothing. The alternative, of course, is people-pleasing. Choosing being liked and feeling okay about ourselves by having everybody's approval at all times and not making anyone feel bad over believing, doing, being something substantive. And it ends up being counterintuitively worse than the other, because people-pleasing means we have to forego being substantive and standing for anything. And at the end of the day, we still can't make them happy. They're still going to find a reason to reject us. Jesus made it plain in Matthew 6, no one can serve two masters. Can't be done. You're going to hate one and love the other. People, whatever it is you believe in, you can't be beholden to both. And there's pain in that, and it's real. And jokes aside, rejection has defined too much of too many of our lives. Living with others' dislike, when we don't wish that, it wasn't our intention, we didn't maybe do anything to earn it or deserve it, it's so heavy and sad. It's a different kind of sadness than losing someone, because that has a beginning and an end, but this goes on. And every day that somebody who's living somewhere out there on the other side of Denver is living in rejection of you, they in effect wake up and re-reject you. And that's painful and hard. Some of us are there right now, and this is hitting kind of close to home. Jesus can relate. He did everything right. You and I probably did something to tee them off. Jesus did nothing. I mean, he teed them off all right, flipping their tables over and releasing their doves and whipping them. But, I mean, if I got whipped in the booty while doing my job, I'd be teed off. But he didn't do anything wrong. He can relate. He understands that pain all too well. There's a temptation in those times that becomes big to cave and compromise, to bounce when it gets hard to believe in something, to run to something more socially acceptable than what it is we stood for that led us to this point of rejection. There's also a temptation, maybe in the other direction, to run to something for illicit, short-term comfort. Right, that, what you just thought of, you know what it is. It's human, we run to it. It's not right, it's not good. After a little living, we know it doesn't work, but it's that old familiar path, and maybe it'll ease the pain or give us comfort for a little while, but the problem with that is it ends up taking more and giving less. It's a little less comforting each time, and we feel all the worse about ourselves for it. So what are we supposed to do? Rodents of unusual size here, a fire swamp there. Jesus says in verse 4, remain. Here's what you do. Remain in me, and I will remain in you. This is a hugely important verse in all of Jesus' teachings, and it's given a lot of attention in pulpits across the world, rightly so. It's also translated, as I mentioned before, abide. About half the translations, minus a couple, are remain and abide, and then there's a few one-offs here and there. But I wanted to get to what Jesus was getting at, and so I did a bit of a word study, and that word remain in the Greek is meno. That's the word Jesus chose. It means, not surprisingly and not very illuminating, to remain, abide, dwell, or live. But I think looking at it in the context of how Jesus used it at other times offers a little bit of broad perspective that'll help us really get what he's telling us and distill his counsel for these particular hard times. Matthew 10, remember when Jesus had appointed his disciples for the first time and he's about to send them out 2 by 2? They're the first ones to take the gospel, to get the keys to the family car, and they're kind of nervous about it, and he gives them some pretty sparse instructions. We talked about this earlier in the John series. He's like, okay guys, here's the instructions. Don't take a change of clothes or money or make any plans. Good? All right, break. And they're like, in the midst of that, Jesus tells them in Matthew's account, whenever you enter a city or village, search for a worthy person and meno, stay in his home until you leave the town. Live there ongoingly. Keep on abiding or residing in that one spot. In other words, recognizing that they're going to be a little skitsy with this new mission entrusted to them, and they're going to feel the pressure to do it right, and so they're going to be like, looking here. Have you ever been with someone where they're talking to you, but they're looking at him and they're thinking about that, and they're really nowhere? Jesus knew his disciples were going to be kind of bouncy like that, so he's like, here's what I want you to do. However many people need to hear the gospel, and there's a lot, however many towns you're going to go to after this one, and probably a few, when you get to one town, I want you to find one place, and I want you to meno. Stay there and keep on staying there. Stop bouncing. Settle down. Be where you are. Be present in that place by volition, by choice. John 14, Jesus says, don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words I speak are not my own, but my Father who menos in me does his work through me. The Father lives and keeps living. That's what it means to abide. That's what it means to remain. Stays there. The Father doesn't pop in, give me a supernatural energy to do this, and then be like, okay, take it from there, Jesus. I got to go save Pluto. The Father remains in me. He's slow, deliberate, and settled. That's the way he is in me. And then look in John 17, he says, that's the way I am in him. As you are in me, as he prays for them, Father, menoing, so to speak, and as I am in you, God, let them be that way in us. Let them share in this ongoing staying, in this abiding. This might make it the clearest. When I was a kid, I was highly energetic. You might imagine. I was always bouncing around. I was the kid that we'd go out to the restaurant, like we'd be at Pizza Hut. We'd be sitting down for 2 minutes. I'd have like folded my napkin up into a football and flicked it like this and pegged my sister in the head, and she'd be all mad already. And I'd have already made origami out of my placemat and stacked my silverware. And then I'd say, Mom, do you have a quarter? And I'd get up, or I'd get up and go look at the jukebox first. And some of you are like, jukebox? And I'm like, it was a thing. And I'd look, flip through, push the button and flip through the songs. And I'd go back and push past my sister and, Mom, can I have a quarter? And then I'd get out again and go back over to the jukebox, and then I'd need to go to the bathroom, and then I'd need to go outside, and finally my parents would be just had it up to here. My mom would say, son, stay put. Did your mom ever say that to you? I mean, did your mom ever like say that to you? Because it'd be kind of comforting to me if she did. So, okay, at least Jack and I had moms that said that to us. Well, we get what meno means. She kind of said meno. Just stay there, but keep staying there. Just plant yourself, settle, chill, abide. That's kind of what Jesus is getting at. And he says it right at this time because he knows that people are going to be disliking them, and that's going to make them want to bounce. There's a core truth in this passage, and I think it could be this. Did you know it is in our darkest days, not our mountaintop moments, not our carefree happy times, but in our darkest days that we decide who we really are? I think that's the core truth here. It's in our darkest days that we decide who we're really going to be, who we are and how we interact with the world around us. When we're at our lowest, I'd suggest that's who we really are. We'd like to believe who we are is who we are on our best days, but that's cheap. Everyone's the best version of themselves on the days when it's easy. Who we are on our lowest days, who we've re-chosen to be on that day, that's who we really are. That's our true identity. Author Sharon Milliman, from a beautiful little book called A Song in the Wind, wrote these words: "Suffering is an inevitable part of life, but it does have a purpose. We can try to run from it, or we can allow it to transform us in unimaginable ways. We can allow it to make us angry and bitter at God, or we can allow it to teach us how to love more fully." She goes on to say, "I have learned that the deepest level of prayer involves praising God in spite of my pain, thanking God during my trials, trusting God when I'm tempted to quit." And then she concludes it with this: "At my lowest, God is my hope. At my darkest, God is my light. At my weakest, God is my strength. At my saddest, God is my comfort." Who we choose to be in our darkest days, that's who we really are. And that's what Jesus is teaching and modeling here. And that's why he says, look, you've chosen to be in me. You've long since chosen that. Gosh, I sent you out with the message and the power. But now that people are going to start rejecting you and disliking you, and you're going to start coming unglued emotionally, now remain. Stay steady. Choose now who you're going to be, and then you will have chosen. And that's one of the values, one of the benefits to hard times. We don't go through them thinking, oh, goody, I'm going to get some character sharpening. You know, sometimes we misunderstand Christian teaching, or we misunderstand text and teach it the wrong way and say, hey, consider it pure joy when you face trials of every kind. And what we think we're supposed to do is go, hey, I'm in a trial. This is so fun. I love it that my friends just made fun of me, because it's going to produce good things. It doesn't say it's joyful. It says, consider a very decidedly unjoyful thing as though it were, because of what it's going to produce in you later. Doesn't mean put on a happy face. It doesn't mean fake it and don't be present. It says quite the contrary, be there, but recognize that we don't go through the hard times without hope, because God redeems them. God works through them. And one of the ways he does that, and this is one of the great values of hard times, is that when we're crashing, we're also choosing. And we're making one of the most important decisions we'll ever make: who we really are. When we're crashing, we're forging our identity. In his darkest days, Jesus himself modeled this. Teaching and deciding anew, I am in the Father, I am in the Father, I am in the Father, and he is in me. Deciding anew to be one with God, deciding it in front of his disciples, over and over and over in these 6 chapters. I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. I am in the Father. That is who I am. And then he invites us to do the same. David went through the darkest of days himself. David, the greatest leader perhaps in history, certainly the world's greatest king, did what was honorable in God's sight. He didn't strive after Saul's crown out of ambition. God told him, you're going to succeed Saul because I'm displeased with him. So David waits and allows God to position him, wakes up to find himself Saul's defender, warrior, fighting his battles, expanding his territory, increasing his influence, and his demon soother to boot. The thanks he gets for it in short order when Saul starts to get jealous is attempted murder, slander, ridicule, and rejection. Ultimately chased from his home, forced into exile, the armies of Israel following him around the wilderness, trying to end his life. David wakes up in his darkest hours, sleeping in a cave, drinking like a dog out of a stream, pretending to be insane in order to stay alive one day, finding fellowship with troublemakers and criminals in order to have security the next. And it is in those darkest days that he wrote what is probably the most famous passage of Scripture. The Lord is my shepherd, and I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters, and he restores my soul. Maybe it hadn't happened yet, but I know he's going to. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, even though I'm going through this metaphorical valley where I'm so close to death that I'm in its veritable shadow, I will fear no evil. Why? Because you are with me, God. He starts off talking about God in the third person, but in a matter of 3 verses can't help himself and switches to talking to God direct address. Because you are with me. He knows what we started this series with, which is what Isaiah said. When you pass through the water, when you pass through the fire, you don't have to fear because I am with you. Doesn't mean you won't get a little hot. Doesn't mean you won't get a little wet. All but promises that you will. But I have called you by name and you are mine. He knows this of God and says, because you are with me. That's why. It's not because of my deft, evil-avoiding skills. It's not because I figured out how the fire swamp spurts before it shoots. Right? Okay. It's because I'm walking through the valley of the shadow of death and you're there with me. And what's more, your rod and your staff, things that fight and discipline, they comfort me. I see that this is going ultimately to be for my good. And on top of that, you prepare a table for me, right in the presence of my enemies. The very ones who are trying to kill me, you set a banquet, a 5-course meal. The guy who's drinking like an animal out of a stream face down says, God, my cup overflows. You've anointed my head with oil. That's the highest gesture of honor in his time. Surely, though I don't see it now, goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. And listen, here's where I choose to stand. I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Now, David had already made that decision. Psalm 27, though it happens after 23, was written long before. In the carefree days in the fields with the sheep when he was looking forward to being king, not knowing the hard, winding road it was going to take him to get there, he said, God, you're my God. I choose you. He said, one thing I ask, this is what I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, not knowing how dark the days of his life were going to get. And then he wakes up on the lowest of them and he chooses it again and says, surely, make no mistake about it, I'm going to dwell in the house of the Lord forever. He chose to stay put. He chose to meno, chose to remain. In verse 12, and we'll wrap up here, Jesus says, this is my commandment, love each other. In the same way I have loved you, love one another. There's no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends. And you are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you slaves, though as I mentioned earlier, you in point of fact kind of are. But I've confided in you. No. I call you friends. In the midst of this cold reality and a truth that cuts to the heart of our hard times, there is a comfort. There is an assurance. At the same time your world is withdrawing its friendship, Jesus is extending his. You can't live and be liked by everyone, but you can be permanently, everlastingly, perfectly loved. Jesus said, I've loved you, in verse 9, even as the Father has loved me. So come on in. The way that we Mino in each other and I get through hard times, walk my road. Mino in my love. Remain. Re-up. Choose it. Jesus will never turn on you. He will never misjudge you, and he will never reject you. He is always faithful. I want to leave you with just a couple of, because this passage in John's writing style is a little here and there, I want to distill what I think we see here in Jesus' example and teaching for us, if it's helpful, how to be maybe disliked like Jesus. What does that look like? Let me encourage you first. Watch your heart closely in the wake of rejection. Scripture says, guard your heart above all else, for from it flows the springs of life. Recognize that we do well to guard our heart all the time, but in times of rejection, our heart goes far afield and we're so troubled we don't notice it. And it can be difficult to get back from that place. And it can create a world of regret that adds insult to injury and makes our life harder. Watch your heart closely in times of rejection. Take note of where it would go. Hem it in. And then Jesus shows us to choose as he chose. Choose your response carefully on that day that you wake up and find yourself unpopular. Maybe that day was yesterday. Maybe that day's coming. When people dislike you, Jesus' life from across the pages and across the millennia whispers to you and says, choose your response carefully, because you're choosing much more than you realize. In those moments, though nobody told you so, you're choosing who you really are. And then lean further in. Lean into Jesus in your low times, the times that your heart wants to bounce, the times that all of a sudden believing something, taking a stand costs you, and you get the wind knocked out of you, your feet cut out from under you, and you're like, what the? In those moments where you would go away because it's gotten hard, lean in to Jesus. And you will find an unswerving, faithful friend. Would you stand with me? God, thank you.